Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and today I'm going to be talking about story components. Specifically for today's video, that means world building, themes, and character, which is kind of how I see a story coming together. And I'm going to mention plot as well, but that comes a little bit later. So this is a version of a talk I gave a couple of weeks ago to a group of young writers, and I've just tweaked it a little bit because I figured it would be pretty useful for everyone else as well. So let's jump straight into it. So yeah, let's talk about world building to kick off with this. So are you really into world building? Of people watching this, do you find world building incredibly exciting? Do you spend a lot of time doing it and thinking about it? And if the answer is yes, the follow-up question, I suppose, is what genres do you write? Because the obvious thing is that science fiction, fantasy writers, we're really into our world building. Like that's where you most associate the idea of world building, right? Sci-fi writers, fantasy writers, they're the ones who like to dive into lore. You know, that's when you think of J.R.R. Tolkien and his extremely long appendices and additional texts going into the world building of Lord of the Rings, rather than just the main story itself as well. But the thing is, all fiction has world building, maybe even some non-fiction as well. Like the idea that world building is unique to speculative genres is, I think, not entirely correct. Like, yeah, sure. So like science fiction and fantasy require world building, like quite a heavy level of it. Like most of the time, they're the genres that require the most heavy lifting when it comes to world building, because without it, it's quite hard to establish them at all. But actually, it's just as important to historical fiction. If you're setting a story in the past in some degree, like whether it's 400 years ago or 40 years ago, the moment a story is set somewhere other than right now, you're doing world building. You have to establish what was around, what wasn't around, how the world worked at that point in time. But you can expand this out to all other genres. You know, they all require world building, because the world that you build is where your story takes place. And even if you're theoretically setting your story in the real world, in quotes, like you are still fabricating that world within the pages of the book. So just to rewind a little bit, let's talk about what a story is. And obviously this is my opinion, like your mileage may vary, but this is how I see it. So you have characters, very important. You have themes, and you have plot. These are kind of the three components of what you need to put a story together. So the plot is things that happen one after another. So what makes that interesting is that in theory, like you could go to Wikipedia and read the plot for a book or a film or what have you, and you would understand the plot, right? Like the sequence of events that happen one after the other. But that experience of reading a plot summary, although it gives you supposedly the key information, it's not the same experience as actually reading the book or watching the movie. That's why these, explainer videos and summary videos you get on YouTube where they explain a book or a film drive me slightly nuts, because knowing the sequence of events is not the same as the thing itself. That's because it misses out on stuff like the themes, and the themes are the reason to tell the story. It's what lifts the sequence of events into something more meaningful. It gives it a point, like what's the point of telling the story in the first place? And then you have characters, and they're there because that's the only reason that anybody cares about the story. So you've got those three things kind of interlinking and interweaving with each other, and then wrapped around the whole lot is world building. So world building kind of sits in the background and is the glue that ties these things together. Okay, so I should probably talk a little bit about what is world building, and what do I think of as being world building. And it's basically everything that's in your story, which I know sounds slightly reductive, but yeah, everything that is in your story, everything you choose to put in, is defining your world. And by that token as well, everything that is not in your story is also building the world. And where this gets really interesting is that this applies to conscious and unconscious choices. So, you might choose to not have spaceships in your world building because you've set your story in the 1980s real world. That's fine. That's a conscious choice. equally, maybe you're writing a science fiction story and you've decided that, yes, there will be telepathy. That's a conscious choice. But the unconscious choices, the ones you can kind of trip into just based on your own personal experiences and biases and blind spots, I suppose, that's where it gets a bit trickier and a bit harder to spot what's going on, because actually world building incorporates pretty much everything you could possibly think of. Like every single aspect that you could put into a story is relevant and factors in to how world building actually works, whether you like it or not, and how you decide to represent these things and what you put in and don't put in does define the world, and different readers are then going to pick up on these things in different ways. So just let's take an example. Let's take one of those things that just popped up. Let's look at transport in more detail. So when world building, making a decision about transport, it could mean that the wheel is not yet invented. And, immediately the world we're building is some kind of, early human, pre-society kind of setup here. But we can move forward to horse and cart, and that puts us in a particular historical period. We go forward a bit further, and maybe there's steamships. And, there have been stories that are set on ships, like ocean liners. And those stories could not exist if they weren't set in a world in which those modes of transport actually existed. So that's kind of like an obvious big example of how the world building affects the storytelling. Murder on the Orient Express, that wouldn't really happen without the existence of trains. And you keep going, And the interesting thing with transport is that it fundamentally shifts how characters can move around and at what speed. And that does affect the kind of stories you can tell. So, if you're telling a James Bond style story, those only really came into existence after planes were a thing, right? Because he's a jet-setting spy who goes to, exciting different locations each time. And if he had to get on a steamship and it took him like weeks or months to get there every single time, that's a different kind of story. When actually he jumps on a plane and off he goes. If you introduce spaceships, how does your spaceship travel work? Is it like Star Wars, where they kind of zip in and out of hyperspace and just appear in the new location, and it's a bit like jumping in a car? Or is it more realistic and it's going to take them months or years to get somewhere? All these decisions set up the world, but also impact directly on the types of stories you can tell within those worlds. So you do have to put the time in to think about this stuff, even if you're not actually dealing with science fiction or fantasy. Teleporters, how would they affect your world? All of a sudden, the entire notion of privacy and security and doors no longer works. So just the addition of something like that can fundamentally shift the entire makeup of your setting. Let's look at another one. So communications. Again, if you set in a pre-society level where you've got humans that have just come down from the trees and can barely communicate, that's one thing. And then if you introduce speech, written language, a postal service, this is all changing the kind of stories you can tell. Telephones, as soon as you can suddenly pick up a phone and communicate across countries instantaneously, that opens up new stories. I think it was really interesting when mobile phones came in that a lot of thriller plot lines suddenly became quite difficult, and horror plot lines. So, I remember watching Buffy back in the 90s, and a lot of plots there required characters to get stuck in rooms, locked in or trapped somewhere. That happened a lot, not just in Buffy. I feel like that was a fairly well-worn plot line used in 1990s thriller TV, and that only worked because mobile phones didn't exist. None of the characters had phones. These days, you get a plot where a character gets locked in somewhere and they just pick up their phone and ask for someone to come and get them. All of a sudden, those kind of high tension, high stakes scenarios are considerably less, and that's why I think you see a lot of thriller type stories which are actually going slightly retro and setting themselves in the 80s, for example. Think about Stranger Things. It's not just for nostalgia purposes. Actually, setting that in the 80s removes certain technologies, which then opens up the types of stories they wanted to tell. Just to go all the way forward, if you have telepathy, how does that affect things? If characters can communicate directly in that manner, what does that mean for the stories that you're telling? So you can see how what you choose to do with your world building will affect what's happening in your story. So to take an example, like this is how I've been doing it for my book. So I've been working for the last 3 years on Tales from the Triverse, which is a kind of mashup of science fiction, fantasy, and crime fiction. It blends all three of those things together, because I couldn't decide what kind of book I wanted to write, so I just did all of them. And the main setting is this kind of alternate 1970s London. It's a police procedural, so each storyline, it's kind of an anthology basis, but each storyline is an investigation into portal-related crimes, and the main characters are detectives who are trying to solve these crimes. And that was really interesting because I needed to build out the worlds, and there are 3 worlds here. There's like a fantasy-based world, a far future world, and this alternate 1970s. So I needed to understand those worlds, particularly because it's crime fiction, and you kind of have to define the parameters with crime fiction so that it's fair to the reader. Like if you're just making stuff up as you go, then the detectives investigating are just, making things up as you go along as well. Whereas if you understand how the world works, the reader then gets that chance to try and work out the crime ahead or with the detective characters. That's a big part of what makes a lot of crime fiction fun, I think. So to do this, I had to do a lot of upfront research. So my research folder is like 20,000 words and counting just by itself. That was before I even started writing the book. I'm not saying that to show off. You don't have to do that. Like a big risk with world building is that you get lost in it and you spend so much time world building that you never get around to writing the actual story. So yeah, don't succumb to the temptation of just kind of wallowing in your own world and forgetting what the purpose was in the first place. But inside this research folder was all the stuff that I needed to understand these fictional spaces. And some of this took place in kind of like standard long-form documents. So I might have something like this, where it's literally a timeline that I've written out to figure out like what happens when in the history of this place. And these are then events that will influence the setting and the characters and can be referenced obliquely or directly. And I have folders like this for each of the worlds, so the fantasy world, the sci-fi world, and the kind of 1970s world. And inside of these folders, I then had these 7 world-building components. And I kind of defined it by these because the thing with world-building, like I was saying, there's a risk that it's never-ending. You can carry on forever, like building a world and taking in every aspect. It can be literally everything. And that's not never-ending. You'll never actually write the story. So for this, I needed to figure out what's the minimum understanding that I needed for this in order to be able to tell this particular story. And these 7 components is kind of what I came up with. So if I understood the technology, the economy, the religion, geography, culture and society, politics, and language, if I understood those 7 pieces for each of the 3 worlds, then I'd be able to differentiate and distinguish them and figure out what was going on. That was my plan. So I went through and jotted down these 7 components, and then I was like, right, I understand these worlds. I can carry on. And beyond that, you then need to bring that world to life, and this is where some of the other story components come in. So I always think the themes of a story are vitally important. Like if you don't figure out what the themes are up front, then you've just got a sequence of events happening one after the other. And the way I think about themes is that they're kind of like a compass. They help you navigate through your story and through your plot. And it means that you always kind of know what the direction is, or at least what the destination is, but you can veer off on tangents, knowing that you can always find your way back to the main story. So up front, I tend to write a little document where I'm like, okay, this story is about X, Y, Z, and I write down maybe 5, 10 core themes. These are the things I want to investigate in this story, and this will change, for each project that I'm working on. But it means that from that point onwards, every storyline, every character, every plot development can be exploring those themes, and it all hangs together. And I think it gives the overall story purpose, but it also means that any readers who are interested in those themes will be continually satisfied, I suppose, as I explore those themes from all sorts of different angles. So all of that is for nothing if you don't have interesting people running around in your world, and having compelling characters is vital. Something I tend to do as a kind of shorthand is just write little mini bios for a lot of characters. So this is for my main characters, but also sometimes for like a guest character, if I want to quickly define them, figure out their speech pattern, how they react to things, and I'll have in, any core information, vitally important bits, a biography. I quite often write in like a conflict or a secret that may or may not come to the fore in the story, but that's something that is motivating them in the background that I know about, but the reader doesn't know about. Maybe even the character doesn't know about it. If they're a major character, I usually work out like what is their character arc, like getting them from A to B over the course of the story. What is that? That can be something big or quite a small little adjustment, but just so that there's always something interesting happening with those characters. That matrix you saw at the top, this is something that Mike Miller got me onto several years back now, actually. It's kind of a variant on the classic Dungeons and Dragons, like lawful, chaotic, neutral matrix, but it's kind of designed more to help with sort of tone of voice, speech patterns, behaviour, that kind of thing. So the idea is that for each of these rows, you pick either the left column or the right column. So at the top, you can pick selfish or altruistic, and then you pick aggressive or passive. And you go down like that and you pick out which one you want. You can just about see here that some of these are in bold, so that defines who this character is. But some of these are contradictory because people are complicated. But the idea is that you put all this together, and then you have a snapshot of who that person is, and you will know how they respond, how they react to any given situation. Very useful. I recommend giving that a shot. So one thing to factor in, particularly with characters, but also with any kind of world building, I touched upon it earlier, I suppose, when I was talking about conscious and unconscious decisions. The obvious advice, the thing that we're always told, is to write what you know. And I'm not so sure about that. I think you shouldn't just write what you know, because, if I did that, then all my stories would only feature middle-aged white men, and that would not be very interesting for readers. It would not be very interesting for me as a writer. Like, I want to have a bit more variety in my stories. So going outside of your comfort zone and trying to include other people, there's all sorts of benefits. Like, it makes it more interesting for you as a writer. It's more interesting for a reader. You'll appeal to a wider range of people. Representation is useful, both from a storytelling perspective and a business perspective and an ethical perspective. It's kind of a no-lose situation, but tread lightly and with respect. Obviously, if you're including characters who are outside of your own experience, you have to make sure you're doing it properly, do your research, talk to people, basically, because after all, I am a middle-aged white man, so I have to know my limits at the same time, but I think pushing at the boundaries makes for more interesting stories. Okay, so we've done world building, and we've done themes, and we've done characters, and let's just talk about plot a little bit. So the main thing to say is, don't chain yourself to your plot. That's very easy to do, where you define your plot to such a fine degree that you have to stick to it, no matter what. And I think that risks making the writing process a bit boring. Like, if you know exactly what's going to be going, you take all the creativity out of the writing itself. So when you start off, you've got your idea, and it could go in any one of these millions of directions. And then over time, once you finish writing it, it will look more like this. Your idea will have flattened into whatever the story is that you put down on the page. If you do this up front, though, there's no exploration in the process of the writing itself. So what I tend to do is kind of work it out as I go along. So I'm continually refining and making things more specific as I go. It's this kind of story loom concept that I wrote about in a separate post. It's very indulgent and silly, but it kind of made sense in my head. And what I actually do is, with my plots, like these little squares here, these are waypoints along the story path, and it means I know that there's certain key events that I need to hit along the way. But how I get from A to B is up for grabs. So there's always an area of exploration in the storytelling, but it also means that I'm heading towards something concrete. And having those themes, which I can use as a compass, helps me find my way from one place to the next. So it keeps the story feeling fresh for me and for the readers, but also having purpose and destination. But yeah, plot, I would say, is overrated somewhat. So if you go back to this thing we were looking at earlier, like, I think you could still have a compelling story without plot, right? If your characters and your themes are strong and you've got an interesting world, you can have a good story out of that. If you're missing themes, if you're missing characters, doesn't matter how good your plot is, like, it's going to feel a bit superfluous, or people aren't going to care, or it's going to feel like it's just a sequence of events. So yeah, ideally you have all three of these things firing on all cylinders, you know. But for me, themes and characters and the world building kind of come first. The plot emerges out of those things, because then your characters will behave naturally based on the needs of the plot. So after all that, like, how do you reveal the world to the reader? So you've done all this work, you've developed everything. Like, how does that practically get it into the text itself? And that's where this little diagram becomes useful. So the water's surface, think of that as your story. And moving along the water is the reader in their little boat, trundling along quite happily and enjoying the surface of your story. And the iceberg is your world building, okay? But the reader only ever sees this bit, like the very top bit that pokes up through the story and makes itself known. But they feel all of it, so the entire weight of it is apparent, even if you're not explicitly saying it. And that's the thing, you don't want to... Like, you spent 6 months, 20,000 words building your world. The temptation then, and I think historical fiction writers must have this temptation even more strongly, the temptation is to include all of it in the text. To be like, look at all this world building I did, and now you're going to enjoy all of it as well. But actually less is more. Like, you don't want to bog down the story with the world building. You want to have it there supporting the story, giving everything resonance, but not getting in the way of what the story is. Because the thing is, the characters have been living in your world for years. That's the thing to remember. Like, the people that are in your world just find it completely normal. So, you know, it's not interesting to them, even if it's fascinating to us as a reader. And, you know, a taxi is just a taxi, even if it's a flying taxi. But if someone's just going to work in the taxi, like, they shouldn't be remarking on the fact that it's flying and doing all this crazy stuff, because to them, it's completely ordinary. And that's a little trick you have to get around. Like, what is the point of view and the perspective on all this stuff? And I'd say, ordinarily, you want to make your world building subtle. You know, use things that are out of place or unexpected references, everyday details which characters find mundane but we don't. Like, just that kind of juxtaposition can be quite exciting and interesting. And like, the last tip is do a food scene. So I remember Ryan Coogler, the director of Black Panther, I remember reading an interview, or it might have been his movie commentary, but he was saying how when they were building the fictional world of Wakanda, when they were making it, he didn't feel like it was quite working until they shot this scene in a market with food stalls and people eating and being completely normal. So, you know, for all the fancy, high, massive buildings and flying vehicles and all of that amazing world building they were doing very overtly, it wasn't until he saw people just eating and doing normal stuff that it came to life for him. And actually, food and seeing people doing like the most essential thing that is human is really important. So like Blade Runner's world building, the thing that I always remember is like the food market and the ramen bars and the atmosphere in that place, and the fact that people went there to eat. That seemed like it told you so much about the world and how the people that live in it stick together. Lord of the Rings, for all of its, you know, high fantasy and adventures and dragons and monsters and what have you, it begins with a big feast. Like, it's a big party in a village. It looks very normal, very English, farming community. It is very understandable. And that's before you then get into all the fantasy stuff. So it kind of lures you in through this normality, and you understand how these hobbits work, basically. Like, a big party with a feast is something that we can associate with. In Naruto, he's always eating ramen. Like, for all the ridiculous, over-the-top stuff that comes as the story progresses, what he really wants to do is go back to the ramen shop, get some noodles, and just hang out with his friends and talk there. And that little kind of hub of complete normality is the thing that binds it together. So even as the action sequences and the powers get increasingly ridiculous and overpowered, you have this root of character and normality in the world building that you can always link to so that, it's not just a sequence of things happening one after another. You have the themes and you have the characters that are driving the story, and that's how it all fits together. So as always, all this stuff is my opinion. There's no really right or wrong way to write. Feel free to disagree with all this stuff. As long as you're writing, that's the main thing. It doesn't really matter anything else. Keep writing and you're all good. But hopefully some of this, and this is my method and how I approach this stuff, hopefully it's helpful to you and helps you deconstruct and then rebuild your future projects in a way that is helpful. Okay, thanks for watching. You can get lots more stuff like this over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.